Afghanistan: the rise, fall, and comeback of the Taliban. Afghanistan is a landlocked Central Asian nation, sharing a border with China, Iran, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. The climate of Afghanistan is arid to semi-arid, hosting hot summers and cool winters. The majority of the nation is mountainous, with the exception of the plains to the north and to the southwest. The country of Afghanistan has an area of 652,230 square kilometers, slightly smaller than the state of Texas, which has an area of 695,663 square kilometers. Afghanistan has a total population of 38 million people as of this year. Of these, 99.7% practice Islam as their faith, the majority of which practice the Sunni branch. The official languages of Afghanistan are Dari and Pashto, with the majority of the population speaking one or both of these languages. 90% of Afghans are facing food insecurity, the causes of which will be explained later. The Taliban was formed in the early 1990s from the Afghan Mujahideen. The Mujahideen were guerrilla freedom fighters that resisted the Soviet occupation of 1979 through 1989 and were backed by the CIA and the ISI, which is the Pakistani equivalent. The name Taliban is the Pashto word for students, as the founders were students of Islam. This newly formed Taliban gained support by promising to bring stability and rule of law to Afghanistan after years of fighting amongst multiple Mujahideen groups. By 1996, they had taken control of the capital city of Kabul, and by 2001, they held 90% of the country. In 1999, the United Nations Security Council placed economic sanctions on the Taliban and its leaders after it was found that they were harboring the terror group known as Al-Qaeda. On September 9, 2001, Al-Qaeda assassinated Ahmad Shah Massoud, commander of the Northern Alliance, an anti-Taliban resistance group. His picture is on the top of this slide. 2 days later, the September 11th terror attacks are carried out by members of Al-Qaeda. Sanctions tightened on the Taliban after they refused to hand over Osama bin Laden, the man who orchestrated the attacks. Ultimately, the U.S. took military action and invaded Afghanistan, officially overthrowing the Taliban government on December 17th of 2001, causing those not captured to flee to neighboring Pakistan. After being defeated in Afghanistan, the remnants of the Taliban regrouped in Pakistan and began insurgency operations in an attempt to regain control of Afghanistan. This and other conflicts in the region resulted in the deployment of U.S. and NATO counterinsurgency forces. Meanwhile, with the assistance of the United Nations, a democratic system of government is set up in Afghanistan, with the ratification of a constitution and the election of a president. At the height of the conflict, there were 130,000 U.S. and NATO troops in Afghanistan. Currently, both the counterinsurgency forces and the Taliban are under investigation for possible war crimes committed during this era. After nearly 2 decades of continuous conflict, an agreement between the U.S. and the Taliban was made in February of 2020. This agreement stated that all U.S. and NATO forces would withdraw from Afghanistan under the condition that the Taliban would cut ties with all terror groups. This withdrawal of troops was completed in August of 2021, with the Taliban taking over almost immediately. Transitioning from an insurgent group to a government has proved to be a struggle for the Taliban. The majority of Afghans are facing food inequality and insecurity, economic instability, and a lack of personal safety and security due to the shortcomings of the Taliban government. The majority of Western nations refuse to officially recognize the Taliban government or to establish diplomatic relations with the Taliban. The United Nations has indefinitely postponed a vote on their representative from Afghanistan due to the Taliban takeover. Along with the war crime investigation, the Taliban government is also under investigation for possible crimes against humanity. The Taliban government is ran by a council known as the Rabari Shura. The members of this council are all men and are either already high-ranking Taliban officials or are extreme loyalists to the group. This council, and the Taliban's rule in general, has resulted in a multitude of human rights violations. The Taliban re-established the Ministry for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice, which could be compared to Iran's morality police. There has been a drastic increase in the number of women incarcerated in Afghanistan since the takeover. Women's rights have been gutted, the media has been severely restricted, and forceful disappearances of dissenters has been occurring. Regrettably, the continued sanctions by the EU and the US has had the unintended effect of hindering humanitarian aid efforts. After the takeover, foreign trade has plummeted, with customs being the primary source of revenue for the Taliban. However, coal exports to Pakistan has increased. The new Taliban government has a yearly budget of $2.6 billion compared to the $6 billion budget of the previous government. Before the takeover, the Taliban relied on crime as their main source of revenue, with the primary source being the cultivation and export of the opium poppy. However, this was banned almost immediately once they took power. Despite the agreement made between the US and the Taliban, there are still concerns that the Taliban supports terror groups. The Taliban government said in response, and I quote, "Afghanistan soil will not be used against the security of any other country." However, a UN team has found that the Taliban still holds close ties to al-Qaeda, which is supported by the fact that al-Zawahiri, acting leader of al-Qaeda, was killed via US drone strike in downtown Kabul. Interestingly, the ISIS-K terror group is seen to be the biggest militaristic threat to the Taliban. ISIS-K claimed responsibility for the attack on the Kabul airport that left 13 US service members and at least 170 civilians dead. In 2009, a study by the Asia Foundation found that approximately half of all Afghans supported or held sympathy for the Taliban. The same study, conducted in 2019, found that only 13% of the population held those beliefs. The overwhelming majority of the survey takers said it was important to protect women's rights, freedom of speech, and the Constitution. As for active resistance, there is the National Resistance Front, a guerrilla group consisting of volunteers and ex-Afghan soldiers. However, this group is not yet strong enough to pose any real threat to the Taliban. When they reached out to the US for assistance, they were denied, with an official stating, and I quote, "Washington does not support organized violent opposition to the Taliban." Here are my sources. Thank you.